Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series in the 2014 Rapid Chess Championships. If you're not too familiar with the format, they play Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday Rapid Chess, and that is a 15 minutes game per player. They also get a 10-second increment for each move that they make, so the faster moves they make, they can actually get more time on the clock than the 15 minutes originally allocated to them. In today's match, we're going to be going over White's going to be played by Fabiano Caruana, in my opinion, the second best player in the world behind Magnus Carlsen. I actually think in a few years he'll be the top player. He has that much talent. So always fun to watch him play. I've done a lot of commentary on him before, and I think he's a phenomenal chess player and really, really young. His opponent's going to be Viktor Bologan, a very, very established player as well. So we'll go ahead and get into it. White starts with pawn to e4. Always love the aggressive lines. And then pawn to g6. Actually picked this opening one because I'm just a big Caruana fan, but I also just don't see the modern defense very often from black, so I thought I'd actually do a video since we saw this defense. Pawn here to g6. Pawn here to d4. Again, White's just going to try to gobble up the center of the board, gain complete control, and then Black's going to try kind of a hyper-modern defense where he controls the center with his minor pieces and then only commits his pawns later into the game. White's also going to try to choke his opponent a little bit as far as gaining a lot of space and not allowing his opponent to really counterattack in the center of the board. We now see pawn here to, or bishop here to g7, fianchettoing on the king side, getting ready to castle very quickly. Knight here to c3. Pawn here to c6, kind of interesting move, but getting ready to push forward with pawn here to d7. Bishop to e3, opening up the possibility for White to actually castle on the queen side. Blitz and rapid chess, you see, in my opinion, a lot more castling on the queen side. It's a lot more aggressive. Usually your opponents are castling on the king side, so you can go ahead and castle on the queen side and then throw all your pieces and your pawns at your opponent on the king side. It does extremely well in very fast chess and in longer games where your opponent has a lot more time to strategize. You just don't see it as much. Usually both sides are always castling on the king side. Black now gets his queen involved to the game with b6, threatening both his pawn here on d4 and the pawn here on b2. So rook over here to b1, not really any other option on board. Knight to f6. Pawn here to h3. Wants to make sure that he kind of stops this knight here to g4. It is kind of an awkward move in this particular opening. Castle on the king side, knight to f3. Getting ready to castle on the king side now. He has that option. He's no longer going to be castling on the queen side, although he may have wanted to. But since he was kind of forced to bring his rook over here to b1, he's not going to be doing that in this particular game. Pawn here to d5. We kind of look at it. Black is kind of cramped in this position, so he has to do something. He right now can't get his knight involved to either c6 or d7, so he needs to get this pawn involved. D5 does a couple things, but one thing it does is it allows Fabiano to actually push forward, completely forget about it, and since these pawns are kind of pointed toward the king side from Black, that's really where White's going to be focusing a lot of his time right here. And so this does gain some additional space for White. Black has to really be wary of that. So Knight's going to come down here to the newly minted outpost here from the pawn here on d5, and then we see a nice little exchange right here, and then the knight's going to fall back here to d2. Somewhat of a passive move. He could have always played a little bit more aggressive with knight here to g5, still attacking the pawn here, but again, this is completely fine. The knight comes back, attacks this pawn, and Black's kind of forced to do something with it. So first plays pawn here to c5, trying to break up the center of the board. Again, Black's strategy with kind of a modern defense is to control from the diagonals, control with his minor pieces, and then kind of chip away with his pawns only after White's kind of already tried to solidify the center of the board. So pawn here to c3, kind of counterattacking. Pawn's going to recapture, so White still has both of his center pawns. Black has just two center pawns, but they're both on the e file, not nearly as effective. Pawn here to f5, solidifying this pawn here on on e4. I think it makes way more sense to take here on f6. This is called en passant. This is not some made-up move that I just came up with. You can look it up if you think that move was illegal. But in the particular game, decided to go with the non-en passant move of just pawn here to g3. Doesn't want his opponent to come down here to f4, and so again that kind of stops that right here. King over here to h8 because this square here on f7 is kind of pushed forward. It's very aggressive, but he does have to be aware that white can now be developing with bishop here to c4, threatening the king, and so he just doesn't want to have to worry about that at all. Pawn here to h4. White now has the possibility of not even castling at all. He recognizes that his opponent's kind of in a corner, and he can just start to push up all of his pieces and never worry about castling at all. Pawn here to h6, trying to stop some of the threats of white pushing forward a little bit too much. Knight here to c4, getting involved into the action. Again, it was pretty passive back here on d2. Wasn't doing a whole heck of a lot. Now attacking the queen. The queen comes back here to d8. Queen to d2, getting it more involved into the game. King to h7, not doing too much, but he does need another defender possibly on the square here on h6. Rook swing over here to d1, more of a centralized square. Your rooks always belong behind your pawns in the center of the board or in semi-open files like this c file, but decided it was more important to bring his rook behind this queen here on d2. Black's now going to centralize his queen with queen to d5. The knight's going to come back here. Knight to c6. Again, Black's getting a little bit of momentum here, getting his pieces involved into the center of the board. Bishop here to c4 kind of stops that. The knight back here is actually allowing this bishop to develop with tempo here. The queen is forced to move. White now decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. So he said, you know, I don't want my pieces being pinned down too much. I do have some safety, although there's a little bit of air over here in front of the king, but my opponent only has one knight, so it's going to be somewhat difficult for him to kind of slip in here. Also, there's a lot of pawns here stopping that, so he thought it was somewhat safe to go ahead and castle on the king side. Black decides to go ahead and exchange off pieces, and again, anytime you're playing someone at the caliber of Fabiano, I think it is good to exchange off some of the more powerful pieces on board. Now, the interesting move in the game is pawn here to e6, and it kind of opens up the door for Fabiano to play a really, really good move, and that's knight here to b5. Now, he had his knight here on a3. It wasn't doing too much. His knight was on the rim. You know, a knight on the rim is grim, but he was going to be getting involved anyway, but knight to b5 is just all of a sudden just detrimental to black. We now see knight here to c7 threatening both this pawn and this rook because the bishop's also attacking his pawn here on c6. It's going to be very difficult for black to kind of hold on to that if the knight comes up here to c7. The rook comes to f7, trying to stop the attack on that square. But knight here to d6. Great little outpost from this pawn here on e5. It's going to be somewhat difficult and tricky for black to kind of get this knight off of this outpost. And again, it's attacking this rook here on f7. The rook is forced to move. Black's pretty much in defense mode. This light square bishop is not involved into the action at all. The rook over here on a8 can't do anything at all. This dark square bishop is kind of blocked off. We see white with a pretty active game plan right here. He has a very active knight here on d6. His light square bishop is much more involved than his opponent. Both of his rooks can easily get involved. Neither of them are on defense duty. So, you know, Caruana definitely has the upper hand in this particular situation. We now have the rook swing over here to c1. Again, those open files really want where you want your rooks. Pawn here to a6. Bishop back here to b3. Kind of a safer square. Rook to b8. It's not doing too much, but again, black just doesn't have a whole lot of options. He definitely doesn't have anything very aggressive. Pawn here to g4. White's pretty much saying that he can go ahead and just blow up the king side of the board. He's not too worried about his opponent's position. So after the pawn takes, now we see the bishop come back here to c2, attacking the square here on e4. This opens up not only this f file, but now he can take with his bishop here on e4. It's very centralized for the light square bishop, so so definitely going to be very good, and black just can't hold on to it anymore. So the bishop takes, the rook's going to swing over here to c7, trying to counterattack on the queen side. He can't do as much on the queen side because all of his pieces are over on the queen side. Knight to e7 or to e8, attacking both of these pieces. The rook's going to have to move. He now brings it back to this nice little outpost here on f6. Now black decides, hey, I just don't want to deal with that anymore, and my dark square bishop wasn't doing a whole heck of a lot anymore, but the pawn takes, and all of a sudden it's a passed pawn, and it's going to be very difficult for black to deal with the rest of the game. It is attacking this rook right here. It comes back to f7, and all of a sudden it's on defense duty once again. Now the bishop's going to come here to f4, attacking this rook, but after the rook moves, because again we talked about coming to b8, didn't do a whole heck of a lot anyway. Now the bishop can come to e5, and in two simple moves, all of a sudden this pawn now has somewhat of a nice outpost, and even if his opponent were to take here on e5, he would still have his pawn taking back and has a nice little dual pawn action right here. Instead, his opponent, Bologan, decided to play a pretty questionable move. He played knight here to b4, and I see this sometimes in the Rapid Championships, but some players just don't recognize when they're under a ton of pressure. In this particular case, Viktor is a ton of pressure, and that's the one opportunity that he chooses to take his piece away from the side that's being under attack. So Fabiano is just going to continue to attack the king side of the board. Pawn here to f3. After it takes, the king's going to move up. Again, we're approaching the end game, so getting your king involved to the action is very, very important. You don't want it to just stay back. It's actually an important piece. Knight here to a d5. Rook swinging back over here to a g1. This is a semi-open file, so white's really controlling. Again, if we look at it, black still has not moved his light square bishop or his other rook over here on a8. We now see the rook's going to take here on f6. Just did not want to see that pawn, which is interesting. Just said, okay, I just don't want to deal with it, so I'm just going to give up that material. White's going to take the knights, and then black just gave up right now. He just looked at it and said, okay, I'm going to take back this pawn. I'm going to lose my rook, and that's going to be bad for me. So, pretty interesting game. Fabiano just found some very small advantages towards the middle of the game, and then he was just able to really get more of his pieces developed, and then Viktor just kind of fell apart at the end. So, again, in my opinion, second best player in the world, kind of proving that he is definitely one of the strongest, and he's near the very, very top of this tournament. I think from what I've seen on day one that he could go on to easily win the rapid section of the championship. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned a little bit and got to see some of the younger players shine on the scene. For more coverage, make sure you check out thechesswebsite.com, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for more coverage.